Greetings, global gardeners. Happy Monday. Time is just flying. We're already into February. I've been getting a lot of gardening done, believe it or not. As cold as it's been across the United States, I've actually had some pretty good weather. I'll be talking about that here in a little bit because that's the focus of the show today is what can you get done in your garden and even outside your garden preparing for your growing season in the month of February. February is actually one of the busiest months of the year for gardeners. At least it can be. Might be in the middle of winter for some of us and the middle of summer for others. But regardless of which side of the planet you're on, February has a lot to offer for the garden. And that's what we'll be talking about today. Shout out to Mary Harmon in London. It's 8 degrees Celsius there, about 47 Fahrenheit. That's about what I have right now. Right now, it's well above average temperatures for me, which is one reason why I'm able to get out and get so much done. And I am taking advantage of it. And shout out to Wedding Bash from Portugal. So nice to see you here as well. Isn't this wonderful, this community we have every Monday? I tell you every week that I look forward to it and I enjoy it. And this is one of those shows as we talk about a new month and getting closer to actually growing outside, I just get more excited every day, every week as we move forward. It is Groundhog Day here in the United States, and Puxatani Phil says there's 6 more weeks of winter. Now, whether you agree with that or not, whether it matters or not, we're in the middle of winter. That doesn't mean that we can't be thinking about our garden or that we can't be out in the garden. I have completely cleaned up my perennial garden bed. I've cut back all of my perennial flowers. I've cut back the grasses. I've added some compost. I've added some mulch. And that's one of those things that, granted, I did it at the very end of January, but February is a great month to start thinking about getting your garden prepared to actively grow your plants. If it's not cleaned up yet, now's probably a pretty good time to start cleaning up the garden, getting those piles of leaves, the piles of brush, all of those plants, start cleaning them up. Now, I'm a huge advocate of leaving plants in place over the winter. But at some point, you do need to clean up the garden. So as I was inspecting my garden in the last week with this incredible weather we've been having, I've been looking at my coneflowers, the echinacea, and seeing that all the seeds, for the most part, had been eaten by the birds. And that holds true with most of my flowering perennials that I left up in the winter for the birds. So with the seeds gone and with the birds basically getting through some of the roughest cold of the winter, that's when I began to clean up my plants to be ready to see the new growth as it emerges in late winter and early spring. With the plants cleaned up, that now gives you the opportunity to survey your garden, see if there's areas you need to add mulch or add compost. Now, I did both. So in my raspberry beds, and I've talked about my raspberry cane borer, which is a pest that can just devastate an entire raspberry patch. So I grow heritage raspberries, and that's a variety that fruits on the first year canes, on the prima canes. So in winter, the raspberry cane borer will overwinter inside the stalk. And then as the weather warms up and the plants begin growing, the larva begins to eat from the inside of the stalk and then eventually chews its way out. And the raspberry cane just falls to the ground. The way to deal with that is to don't give them any place to overwinter. Chop the raspberry canes down all the way to the ground. That's what I did this week. So that should eliminate the problem with raspberry cane borer in my garden this year. And now that the raspberries are all cleared out, I can start thinking about adding nutrition to the soil. Raspberries in particular, perennial flowers, grasses. When you get an area established with those plants, we often forget about the soil and its health. Putting an organic mulch on top is a great way to introduce organic matter in that surface portion as the soil life helps decompose and add the nutrients to the top of the soil. But particularly if you're using a wood mulch like I do, it takes a long time to break down. So when I cleared out my raspberries, I added a couple inches of compost on top of that mostly decomposed mulch from last year. With compost spread throughout that area, I then added more wood chip mulch. So by using February, this time of year in winter when things are dormant and you can see the bare spots in your garden, it's an opportunity to add mulch around your fruit bushes, to add mulch around your grasses and your perennials, and then to add any other nutrients. If you're a fertilizer person, this is the time of year that you can spread a slow release fertilizer on top of the soil and then put some mulch on top of it. The idea being that naturally you'll get nutrients in the soil, but it can take a long time for those surface mulches to break down. By adding the compost, which is already mostly decomposed, and adding fertilizer on top of the soil, you can often give your plants a boost for the growing season. Hello to Shawnee, and shout out to Jay and Shawnee, of course, our wonderful moderators. Shawnee says, February has started with ordering a few final seeds, labeling and packaging saved seeds from our land, and starting the onions and celery indoors here in Zone 5A, Minnesota. So this is wonderful, Shawnee. Thank you for this prompt. Those are definitely good ideas and definitely stuff that I wanted to talk about today. Ordering your seeds is a great February activity. Now, I was online this weekend looking at a lot of the sites for the seeds and for the plants that I'm thinking of getting this year, and a lot of them are already sold out. February is kind of the end of the best window to order the things that you want in your garden. Now, you can still order seeds all through February and into March, but recognize that if there's something that's very popular, something that you really want, the earlier you do it, the better, to ensure that you can actually have it in stock for it to be sent to you. So the final seeds, those last ones like Shawnee, yeah, now's a really good time to do that. And then also the save seeds, that's a wonderful idea. As I've been setting my operation up to start growing the seeds here in just the next couple of weeks, that's the issue I have. I've got paper bags filled with seeds, and the labeling is just very generic, like pea seeds or grass seeds or echinacea seeds. And so getting those labeled and stored in the February month is a good idea. It can be a little disorderly for some of us in our seed operation. And so as you're thinking about getting your seeds going, start thinking about putting them in some type of order. I've got videos about how you store the seeds and how I save my seeds. But I've been doing that in the last couple of days as well, going through all my seeds, seeing what I have, what I don't have, what I need, and also the seeds that I'm not so sure about. So about a year ago, I actually had my hydroponic system leak a little bit, and I had a box of seeds on the floor, and the water hit the box, and a lot of those seed packages ended up fusing together. That's one of the things that I did this week as well, was to take all those seed packets, some of which I couldn't even identify anymore. I removed all the seeds. I put them in a cup, mixed them all together, and then just went out and spread them throughout the garden. I show that in one of my videos where a couple of videos. I talked about the guerrilla gardening, where you can just throw the seeds out and hope that they'll grow in the bare spots. But the chaos gardening idea, where you just take a bunch of seeds, mix them together, and just throw them out in the garden. And that's what I did as I was organizing my seeds and coming across those packages. Some of them, the seeds are very old. Some of them, the packages are no longer suitable for storage. I just spread them all throughout the garden because I've got a nice clean garden area to spread those seeds. So thinking about your seeds in February is definitely a great idea. And then thinking about what you can start. So Shawnee says onions and celery in Minnesota. Onions in January and February are typically when you're going to want to start them. And the cool season plants, a lot of the brassicas that you might be putting out in the garden during the cool months before your last frost date, you can start working on some of those in February. But even some of the warm season plants, those ones that are going to be growing during the middle of summer, knowing your last frost date, as I've said many times before, is very important. And some, like eggplant, it's recommended to start your eggplant 10 to 12 weeks before your last frost date. So that's 3 months. For those of us with a last frost date in May, then February is when we start our eggplant, just because it takes a long time to germinate, takes a long time to grow. And by the time you get it to the size that you want, everything is warmed up outside and you can put them outside. The end of February could be a time for focusing on peppers. And depending on your last frost date, again, you might actually be starting tomatoes in the month of February. So start putting together your plan. And February is a great planning month to look at your calendar, to look at the dates like the last frost date, to look at when plants should be started. And if you haven't done that yet, you might be surprised how many of those things actually should be taking place in February. If you've got a last frost date in April, February may be one of the busiest months of the year as far as starting your seeds and getting those plants started. Mushroom Snail is saying, I've planned, but still need to decide on a way to trellis pie pumpkins. That's great, the planning, and this actually brings in another aspect. So thank you for raising this question as far as the trellising. Once you get your garden cleaned up and the spaces are cleared and you start planning what you're going to grow, putting some of those structures in place, like trellises, great time to do it in February, before the plants are growing, before you're putting the plants in the ground. Get some of those structures in place. Now, I have an open patch on top of my hugelkultur bed, and that's where I grow my pie pumpkins. And most pie pumpkins do not have a long vine. So if you're growing some of the jack-o'-lantern varieties and some of the bigger pumpkins, those vines can be 10, 15, 20 feet long. Most of the varieties of the sugar pumpkins, like the New England sugar pie pumpkin, those might only be 5 or 6 feet long. So I don't worry too much about trellising them because I have a space that's big enough to handle those smaller vines. So consider that when you're growing pie pumpkins as to how much space they're going to take up. But because they're small, they actually do pretty well on a trellis. One of the trellises that I've used before, I haven't used it in a few years, but I show it in some of my older videos, is the frame of a bunk bed. I came across at a yard sale years ago an old bunk bed, metal bunk bed that was being sold. And I looked at the frame where the mattress sits on top. It was metal. It's strong. It's designed to hold the weight of a person sleeping on it. And that's what I use for a trellis, for those heavier vegetables. And so I have trained hundreds of cucumbers and squashes up that sturdy trellis, and I just bury it in the ground. So it's a bunk bed. So it is like 7 feet long. And I'll bury about 2.5 feet of it into the ground. And now that leaves me with a 4 or 5 foot tall sturdy metal trellis. And so those fruits that are vining and a little bit heavier, I'll train up it. And I only did it 1 year for the pie pumpkins, but it is an option. If you can find something sturdy like that that you can bury in the ground, it's an easy way to deal with trellising. And you might be able to find something like that at a thrift store or a garage sale. And you don't need to use it as a bed. You can buy a bed and not use it as a bed. You can buy a bed and put it in your garden bed and use it as a trellis. So it's actually worked out pretty well for me. And I've actually enjoyed using it. Maybe I'll do it again this year. Now that I'm thinking about it, it might be one of those things to put back into the rotation. But trellising in February can be good. Now, yesterday I went out, I got my spade, I attempted to dig into the soil. And even though the weather yesterday was above 50 degrees, above 10 Celsius, the soil is still frozen here in Colorado. So I can't do a lot of digging, but I can do the exploration to see if the ground is still frozen. And so over the course of February, especially as the days get longer, we're going to gain about an hour of sunlight over the course of February. I'll be doing that on a regular basis. I'll be testing my soil so that I can figure out when it has thawed to the point that I can start thinking about doing some transplanting, that I can think about maybe digging in some compost and adding organic matter. Another reason to do that kind of testing through the month of February is that when we divide and transplant a lot of our perennials, our grasses, our flowers, our clumping plants, you want to do that when they're dormant or just beginning to wake up. That typically is in February, late February, maybe early March. But during the course of the month, test your soil. Start seeing if it is thawing yet, or like in my case, if it's staying frozen. And when you finally get to the point that the soil can be worked, and you'll see that on seed packets, sow seeds as soon as soil can be worked. That's what it's talking about. It's talking about the soil no longer being frozen. You can get a spade into the soil. You can push a trowel into the soil. As soon as you reach that point where you can begin working your soil, think about dividing some of those clumping plants and then transplanting them into new areas. Great time of year to be thinking about enlarging your garden. Before you're even really seeing a lot of growth, you can start doing some of those activities. But you have to know when the soil is ready to go. And that does require some testing. You can take a thermometer. I've got my compost thermometer that I've shown in various videos as I test the soil temperature. Do that in February as well. Start tracking the temperature of your soil. It's very important, particularly for your summer crops. So putting your tomatoes in the ground, your peppers, your eggplants, putting the squash and cucumber seeds, your soil needs to be warmed up to the point. Usually it's about 70 degrees Fahrenheit in the 21 Celsius range. So I'm measuring the temperatures for those warm season plants, but you can do the same thing during the cold season to find out when the soil is ready to be worked, when it is no longer frozen. And you might be able to do some winter sowing. Take some of those seeds, put them outside, and as the soil begins to thaw, as the days begin to warm, some of those seeds might be able to germinate and give you some new plants very easily. And it's those new plants or those new seeds that you put out that nature decides when they're going to germinate and how they're going to grow. Sometimes those can be your strongest and most successful plants. Mushroom Snail again says, I'm waiting for seeds to appear at the local store. I only need onion seeds. That's another great thing to do in February. And actually, I hadn't intended on adding that to the list of discussion today, but it's a great one. I'm doing the same thing as I'm going to the stores and I'm seeing all the Valentine's Day candy. Pretty soon, those aisles are going to be replaced with seeds. and with seed starter kits and with potting mixes. And so, yeah, start keeping your eye on it, especially for like the dollar store. So I've talked about this before. Seeds are seeds, and you really don't have to pay a lot for seeds. And so you, at least around me, the dollar store, I think they typically have 4 or 5 packet of seeds for $1.25. Great bargain. Seeds are wonderful. They're generic seeds, nothing too unique. But because they're such a great price, they get snapped up right away. So if you're looking for some bargains with the cheap seeds like that, you got to start looking in the stores. You got to be ready for when they're going to be stocked. For the bigger selections at the bigger stores, it's not as big an issue, but there are some specialty seeds that might only be available for a brief period. For many of us, that's January. That's when the seeds are going to be put into the stores, and when you want to start looking for those type of choices. And a plant is a plant. You know, a green bean is a green bean until you find a green bean that you really like. And that's what I talk about or that's what I'm talking about when I say looking for those specialty seeds, the ones that you really want in your garden, that you're really looking for. You might have to be early. Online, you definitely have to be early. In the store, you definitely want to be one of the first ones to see what new seeds are coming out. Shandy's Garden is saying, since I'm stuck waiting for spring to plant flower bulbs and garlic I couldn't put out in fall, is it better to start them in pots under lights indoors? Do they transplant well? And so most bulbs, to include garlic, you might have mixed results with the transplanting. And so generally the reason we're putting a bulb in the ground is because when the soil temperature is right, it will start developing roots and will get established in the soil. And so when you transplant a bulb that already has that root development, you run the risk that you might cause some damage. To add new roots, it's going to have to take more energy from the bulb, and then that energy cannot be used in growing the flower stalk and the flowers. And so that's one of those concerns, that you could have root damage that will ultimately kind of sap energy away from the bulb. If you grow in something like a peat pot or a manure pot where you can put the whole thing in the ground, then that might be a better option. So yes, you can start bulbs, to include garlic, in pots. I would suggest you try not to do it in the kind of pot where you're going to have to take it from the pot and the soil's going to fall apart and you're going to damage the roots. Instead, think about putting it in an organic pot that's going to break down in the soil. Even though peat pots take forever to break down in the soil, it is an option. And when they're wet, the roots will grow right through them. So that is one of those considerations, particularly for the garlic. If you're not storing them, and it also holds true for many bulbs as well, store them in the refrigerator, because a lot of those bulbs need exposure to cold temperatures to be able to, in the case of garlic, the clove needs to have the exposure to cold for it to then turn into a bulb later in the year. And some of the flower bulbs also need that cold temperature for them to do well and flower in that same year. So store them in your refrigerator. And yes, you can start them in pots, but just be aware that they don't transplant as well as a lot of other plants. So you might need to take some of those extra precautions. But it might be better than not putting them in the ground and they dry out and you've lost the opportunity completely. So I'd rather put them in the ground and not have the best success than to keep them out of the ground and maybe run into some issues. Serena's asking, how soon after the last frost date should squash or melon seeds be planted for optimum growth and production, and how many male flowers should I pinch off to get female flowers? So first off, it gets back to the temperature. The temperature should be warm It should be in that 70-degree Fahrenheit, 21-degree Celsius range as a minimum to get the best results, the optimum growth. And then the other part, you don't need to pinch off male flowers. So male flowers are going to appear first on squash plants, and then you wait, and the plant kind of has its own timing, where the reason it's putting out the male flowers is because as soon as that female flower appears, there has to be the male flower there to pollinate it. So that's the normal timing. You're going to get male flowers, you're going to get only male flowers. And then when the conditions are right, the female flower will appear, and the pollinators will be bouncing back and forth between the flowers. And because you've got the male flowers ready to go, that female flower is going to be pollinated as soon as it opens. That's the way nature has designed it. So if you're pinching off male flowers and then the female appears, you might actually not get as good pollination. You might not get any pollination. The male flowers will naturally fall off. They're only going to be viable for a day, maybe two. The pollen within the male flower is going to degrade in the sun and in the weather. So the male flower is going to be there, and then it's going to fall off. Yes, you can pinch off the male flowers as soon as they appear, and that will sustain some of the energy within the plant. But I've never had an issue. I just leave the male flowers, and as soon as the female flowers appear, the fruit is going to be following shortly after. So it isn't, there isn't a correlation. It isn't like because you pinch off male flowers, it means the female flower is going to appear. And in fact, it might be the opposite. If you keep pinching off the male flowers, the plant is going to keep producing male flowers because those male flowers have to be present when the female flower appears. So that's one of those things that I've never done and never seen a reason to do, is pinch off the male flowers. And I always have plenty of squash, always have great pollination because everything is ready to go, and the fruit follows soon after. But is saying with last frost date of mid-April, I start seeds for peppers, tomatoes, and numerous flowers. Yeah, exactly. And so that's why February can be such a busy month, because, you know, I think in terms of a last frost date of May, of course, because that's what's the appropriate time in my garden. But that's not the case for everybody else. And so while I'm doing more planning and buying of seeds and thinking about starting, you might be in that case like Bud, where February is, you got to be active. You better make sure you're doing some stuff so that you can have the plants ready to go when you're finally able to go outside. Now, remember, the last frost date is just a guideline. It's a point on the calendar for you to plan what you're going to do with your plants. It's not necessarily a hard date for when you should plant, for when you should sow your seeds. It all depends, which is why the temperature of the soil can be a more important factor for me, because like right now, my ground is still frozen. It thaws very slowly. I'll hit my last frost date and the soil temperature still will be cold. It won't be frozen anymore, but it'll still be very cold. And I normally don't hit the minimum soil temperature that I'm looking for until about 2, sometimes 3 weeks after my last frost date. So use the last frost date as a guideline. But if you really do want to take your gardening to another level, start measuring the temperature, and you'll find that it may be a couple weeks after that last frost date before you're actually able to do the things in your garden, like putting the plants in the ground for the best success. And that's really what I'm looking for. And so Doreen Hendrickson is asking, curious, do you do winter sowing? And so I do, like I was just talking about a few minutes ago, where I take seeds. And so I'll just spread my extra seeds, but then I'll also take some seeds, the kind of seeds that require cold stratification, and I'll put them into specific beds during the winter. So from that perspective, yeah, I do a lot of winter sowing. I don't do as much, even though I got a video on the winter sowing using the milk jugs. I don't do as much of that anymore. But if there is a particular, usually it's a perennial flower or a native plant that I've got the extra seeds and I'm kind of testing, then yes, I'll do the milk jug, where you cut a milk jug in half and you put the potting mix in the bottom and put the seeds in, and then tape the top over, basically creating a little mini greenhouse, and then putting it outside so that the air temperature and the sunlight is what determines when those seeds are going to germinate. So I don't do as much of that anymore because I'm doing direct sowing. Same idea. The difference is that if you do it in a milk jug, you then have to transplant it into a bed. So I'm doing the same thing. I'm just kind of bypassing that transplanting step, but I'm still putting some seeds in the ground during winter. And it's usually, extra seeds or seeds that I have more of, because I've got birds, I've got insects. I'm going to be losing some of those seeds as a food source for something in my garden. So I want to make sure I have extra seeds to sow when I do winter sowing. If it's a plant where I don't have as many seeds, or I'm really wanting to get the perfect germination and grow as many seeds as possible, then I'm doing indoor seed starting for those kind of plants. But yeah, it's a great option. And February can be a great month to start doing some of the winter sowing. There you go. Jay's on top of things. There's a link to that video on how I do that winter sowing with the jugs in particular. And now, because my pollinator garden is mostly established, I'm just putting seeds in some bare areas and seeing what pops up. I kind of like that chaos, like I talk about in my chaos gardening video. But it says, I'm super excited to see my Japanese maple trees starting to emerge in my outdoor germination bin. Cool. This was my first attempt at winter sowing outdoors. Nice. So yeah, that's the idea. Like I was just talking about, where I have beds that I'm putting seeds for winter sowing. Same idea as what Bud's talking about. So and that's so much fun. So February is a great month. I talk about it in a recent video where I'm walking through my garden and I'm looking and observing and just spending time in the garden. So the last couple of days I did that. And it's really interesting to see what is happening, what plants are doing, and how they're affected by the weather. Now, this has been pretty warm winter for me so far. We've gotten down to about 15 degrees, about -9 Celsius. And that is much warmer than we typically have seen by this point. Yes, it's very cold, but for me here in Colorado, that's 2 complete zones higher than what I normally see in winter. And so a lot of my strawberries still have green leaves on them. And I was looking at my creeping thyme, still got green leaves. As I was cleaning up the garden and pruning back, my feverfew, for instance, a plant that I've just put in recently, has green growth at the crown of the plant after I took off all the old dry flower stalks. And so you may actually see some new growth in your garden in February, particularly if you're having a warm stretch like I am. One of the things to think about, depending on the plant, is if you live in a cold area and the cold hasn't come yet, and you're starting to see some of this growth, if the cold returns with a vengeance, you might need to protect some of those plants. I'm a little concerned about my fruit trees, because some of my fruit trees looks like the buds are starting to swell. And that's great for March or April. It's not as good for the beginning of February. And so be ready with a protection plan for some of your cherished plants that might be affected by warmer, unusual temperatures. You might want to throw a tarp over those plants if you get some very cold nights, just to prevent potential damage to those plants. Now, it's difficult to do with trees, but my fruit trees are still relatively young, and I'm keeping an eye on it. If some of those trees start budding and I end up with another cold snap, I might have to go out and throw some tarps or blankets or sheets over those trees just for a night or two, just to help protect them. And that can make the difference. I've lost trees in the past here in Colorado because that's a pattern we often have, where the winter is warm, 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 warm. It fools the plants into waking up, and then we get slammed with a hard, hard freeze that really can damage the plants. So you have to just be aware of that. Always keep looking at your garden throughout the year, but particularly during this transition phase where maybe some of your plants might be waking up, and you got to be aware of that. Jay says, tip, dollar store seeds are basic and small quantities for 25 cents to $1.25. Yep. It's a great idea to take advantage of cheaper prices and you're getting the same basic product that you would be getting for a lot more. And Robin's right. Those Dollar Tree seeds are perfect for the common stuff like French breakfast radish, the basic lettuces, the basic beans, the basic tomatoes, the kind of stuff that you see everywhere. Those are the kind of seeds that you're going to be able to find for almost no price at all when you start thinking about it. You know, some of the specialty tomato and pepper seeds that I get might be, you know, $5 for a packet of a Hungarian pepper. You can get 20 or more seed packets at some stores, like the dollar stores, for that same $5. They're not going to be the very specific Hungarian pepper varieties, but there'll be different bell peppers and different hot peppers. So as long as you, or if you're looking for savings, and as long as you're willing to just grow some generic stuff, yeah, consider that as definitely a viable option to consider if you are gardening on a budget. Matt says the squash plant has to be big enough to support fruit. The plant knows when this happens. Exactly. Yeah. The idea behind the male flowers and the female flowers, it's soil temperature, day length, size of plant. There are a lot of factors that go into play. Now, I will say, be careful if, you know, I was talking about preparing your garden, cleaning it up, maybe adding fertilizer if you feel like you need to. A big reason why I do not add fertilizer to my vegetable garden beds is because I'm using compost, because I'm developing a nice, healthy, nutrient-rich soil naturally. But if you're using a lot of fertilizer in your garden beds, it can affect the way the plants react. And so a big reason why you might not get those female flowers set on your squash plants is because you've got too much nitrogen in your soil. If you're using a nitrogen fertilizer and you're thinking that's going to help your plant set fruit, it's just the opposite. That nitrogen is going to give the plant a big boost to grow leaves and stems, not the flowers and the fruit. So be careful about how you fertilize, particularly in your vegetable garden. And if you're looking for the flowers and the fruit, you might want to focus more on the phosphorus and the potassium rather than the nitrogen in a fertilizer. I just don't worry about it by not fertilizing, because I enrich my soil and try to get it to the point that it's providing the nutrients within the soil because of the microbes and the compost and the organic matter. And I've talked about that before, but be aware of that the flower imbalance on cucumbers, on squash, on melons, if it's not happening the way you think it should, it could be because you've got too much fertilizer, usually too much nitrogen fertilizer, that is causing the problem. So learning a little bit more about that, experimenting with it, trying some new options like not using the fertilizer, and then seeing how well your plants do. Those are all good things to start keeping track of and documenting, putting in your garden journal, because it does make a difference. You know, I see so often the recommendation of using fertilizer. Use fertilizer every 2 weeks. Use fertilizer every week. Use fertilizer in this amount and that amount. There's just so much advice about using fertilizer. Well, if your soil is terrible, if it's sterile, if there's no nutrients, then yeah, some of those fertilizer recommendations might be appropriate. But if you're like me and you're an organic gardener and you're building your soil, fertilizer can often get in the way. And that's one of those things that you kind of have to learn the hard way. And it's kind of a sad lesson, but just be aware that it is a potential problem if you're not right on top of it and monitoring what happens in the garden. Look to Nature Homestead is saying, anyone who loves the color purple, you owe it to yourself to check out some images of the Gero Roxa purple perfume pepper. I haven't looked at that. It's an absolutely stunning plant and pepper. I got my seed from Rare Seeds. Awesome. So yeah, Baker Creek Rare Seeds is a great place to go for unique. And so when I was talking about getting the seeds, you're not going to find Gero Roxa purple perfume pepper at your dollar store. You're probably only going to find it at bearcreekrareseeds.com. And that's a key difference when we're buying our seeds. But yeah, I love Baker Creek and the idea of finding a purple pepper. I like that idea too. So I've already looked through my Baker Creek catalog a couple times. I'll have to go back and look at the pictures for that purple pepper. Thank you for highlighting that. That can always be fun. So Trickstar saying, I saw a specific tomato in Johnny's seeds that was $25 for 10 seeds. Is that because it's new to the public? There could be a few reasons. So yes, often when a seed is introduced for the first time, the seeds are going to be more expensive. That's very common. It could also be because of the type of seed it is. And so Johnny's does a lot of developing of seeds, and it takes a lot of time and a lot of money to develop a new seed. So generally, if you have a seed developer, from the time that they start trying to develop a new variety to the time that those seeds are on the market can be 10 years. And so there's a lot of costs associated with growing the mother plants and the father plants and doing the cross-pollination and then doing the testing. And then you've got years where you're making sure that the genetics of the seed are stable. That helps add to the cost of those seeds. And so in the first couple of years for those new varieties, yeah, 10 seeds for $25 is a little surprising, but that could be the explanation for it. Is it something that is very specific, very special, that the tomato plant in particular has some very specific resistance to disease, or some very specific fruit that it is producing? That's a big reason for it. It's a little more common that I see in seed companies that it might be like 10 seeds for $5. 25, it seems a little high. Whereas the common seeds, like we were talking about the dollar store seeds, you'll get a packet for $1.25 of some type of tomato seed, and there might be 50 seeds or more in that dollar seed packet. The specialty seeds, and I've bought pepper seeds like this. For instance, some of the super hot peppers that I grow periodically, it might be 5 seeds for $10. I think that's the most I've ever paid for seeds, but because they were very specific, super hot pepper seeds, and you get a little package of just a few seeds in it. And that is a big reason. Sometimes because it's new, but sometimes just because it's very special and it might be a little more difficult to collect the seeds. But if that's what you want to grow and you're willing to pay it, go for it. And it doesn't sound like you actually bought those $25 seeds, you just saw it, but it's an option, especially if you are really focused and trying to do some new innovative things in your garden. Big Will Dog is asking, do perennials typically learn the misdirection of the weather as they grow, or is it mostly just the age that allows adaptation? So they don't technically learn, and I think you know that. It is more the adaptation. And so we might think of it as learning, but every plant is unique. And so when we're looking at the plants in our garden, they may look identical, and the fruit may taste the same from one plant to the next, but every plant has a slight difference in their genetics. And so what happens when over a period of time you're growing the same plants over and over again, those slight variations are going to allow your plants to adapt. And it's not that a plant is adapting that year, it's that that plant has a genetic difference. And when it produces flowers and it produces seeds, the next generation is where the adaptation comes in, and particularly with the changing weather, and it could be anything actually. It's not just weather. It could be soil conditions. It could be the location with shade and light. All of those different things that influence how a plant grows can be overcome by the plant through the process of adaptation over a long period of time. So it's not like the plant is saying, oh, it's a lot hotter now, I think I'm going to develop the ability to handle this extra heat. No, it's just the plants that have that slight genetic anomaly are the ones that are going to survive the heat. And then their seeds and their offspring will be more likely to be able to handle the heat. And after a few generations, the plants that remain have adapted to the changing environment. So it's kind of a passive learning, if you want to think of it that way. But no, it really is the adaptation of the genetics, and you can do that. You know, I've suggested that within, you know, my garden. That's what I'm doing. I grow black Krim tomatoes every year. I've been growing black Krim tomatoes for a couple decades now. The last time I bought black Krim tomato seeds was for a video I think I made 6 or 7 years ago. But I had black Krim seeds before then. So every year when I save my seeds from plants like the black Krim tomato, I'm saving the seeds from the strongest plants, from the plants that are doing the best in my garden. So I am basically choosing the adaptation. I'm choosing the fruit to save the seeds from the plants that are doing best. And so you can really be the one in charge when it comes to saving the seeds and looking for those slight differences. And it really can make a big difference. Karen is saying, I use old sleeping bags and cheap fluffy bedspreads to wrap plants. Floodlights, a couple of small heaters or heat lamps in the hoop greenhouse saved everything last year. Awesome. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. That's exactly my point that I was talking about, trying to protect your plants if you have a particularly cold night. And yeah, great idea. I hadn't really thought about the old sleeping bags, but that's a wonderful idea. Yeah, bedspreads and sheets and tarps are what I typically are using. But you're extremely good point. Got to have something. So if you've got a shed or a garage or an old closet, yeah, have some of that stuff ready to go so that you can put them outside. And then if you've got the ability to use some floodlights or heaters or heat lamps, that can make all the difference in the world. If you have a terrible cold snap, that really could make a difference between your plants surviving and your plants not surviving. That's a big deal. Jason is saying, I'll be using fertilizer in my garden for the first time ever. True organic liquid veggie food. Can't wait to see the results. Good for you. Yeah, and again, this is one of those things. I'm not saying don't use fertilizer. I'm just saying I don't. But when you do use fertilizer, absolutely check the results, document it, see what's happening, see if you like it, see what the differences are, and that can definitely influence how you approach gardening for the future as you learn those things. Jay is reminding everybody that this Sunday I'm going to be a featured guest on the Urban Gardener Let's Get Growing show. And so I do it the second Sunday of the month. We didn't do it last month, so this will actually be the first one of the year that I'll be with Enoch Graham. So thank you, Jay. And it's Super Bowl Sunday, so I'll actually be doing his show and then going to some friend's house to get ready for the Super Bowl party. So I don't know how many of you might be doing a Super Bowl party, but I'm actually combining gardening with my Super Bowl activities on Sunday. Can't miss out on either one. Matt is saying maintaining open pollinated seed varieties requires a lot of plants for growing just seeds and culling the poor performing plants. That costs money. Yeah, you're exactly right. And it takes time. And like I said, you can do it in your own garden. But if you're doing it professionally, commercially, it takes a lot of plants over a long period of time. And it definitely costs a lot of money to be able to make that happen. Mobius says, how often would you use a worm compost / nettle / comfrey tea on growing plants during the season, properly diluted? So when I do it, and I've got a couple of videos. I got a video on making comfrey tea, and then I've got a video where I combine my comfrey with nettle with dandelion to make a tea. I typically do those as just kind of a boost, and it's twice, maybe 3 times a year. And I'm just pouring it to the soil just to kind of give a boost of nutrients to the soil, and also some of the microbial activity that takes place when you're doing an extract or a fermentation with those plant materials. And so I'll usually do it while the plant is still young, and then I'll often do it, if I do it a second time, it'll be as the plant is approaching the fruiting phase. And I usually, because I don't want to disrupt the fruiting by having too much nitrogen. Sometimes those teas might have a little bit excess nitrogen. So I usually wait until the fruit is set, and then I'll do another course of those organic teas. And most of the time, it's not adding a lot of nutrients. It's more that it's adding some organic matter to the soil. Because even in a tea where you are putting all those leaves and stems and letting them break down, and it's basically fermenting, it's not going to be fully broken down by the anaerobic bacteria. So you'll still have pieces of the organic matter that you're pouring onto the soil, and it will continue to break down. And so I kind of look at it more as a way of just adding mostly decomposed organic matter to my soil than I'm actually adding the nutrients. If you do an analysis of some of those teas, often they really don't have a lot of nutrients. There are some, but often in a much lower percentage than you might expect. It's really adding the liquefied organic matter, and that's a big reason why I do it. But yeah, usually twice, sometimes 3 times. A lot of it depends on the length of my growing season and how the plants are doing, and I'll let the plants talk to me to decide whether or not to take care of those plants. So keep that in mind if you're going to use a tea. It's not going to be like the liquid soluble blue fertilizer that you are buying, mixing with water and pouring into the soil. That gives you an instant boost of nutrients. Even the teas are going to take a little while before you'll see the results, and before that organic matter and those nutrients can be released to your plants. So kind of take that into your planning process, why you're doing it, and what the difference is going to be when you actually pour it onto your soil. So Matt is saying, I know tomatoes are perfect flowers that can self-pollinate, but you have to worry about cross-pollination. I know you grow a lot of varieties in close proximity. So you're exactly right. And so there are a number of plants that we grow in the garden, and it's what they call a perfect flower, which means it has both the female and the male parts that are within the same flower. So the pistil and the stamen are all right there. And because of the shape of a tomato flower, it is most likely that the flower is going to pollinate itself. And so I don't worry about it. I'll grow tomatoes that are 18 inches apart, and I'm just operating under the assumption, and I know what happens when you assume anything, but the likelihood of those flowers pollinating themselves are much greater than the likelihood that a bee or a fly or a wasp or any type of insect is going to pollinate the different tomato plants before the natural perfect flower pollination happens. The chances of that are very, very low. And so I'll still save the seeds. But again, if that next generation is a cross-pollinated result and I don't get what I'm looking for, then I'm not saving those seeds. So I'm really only losing one generation, worst case scenario, if there is a cross-pollination. And you never know, you might actually get some cross-pollination and like the results. But I've never seen, in all of the years I've been growing tomatoes 18 inches apart and saving the seeds, I've never seen the results of a hybrid, essentially a cross-pollination in the following year. So no, I don't worry about it at all. If I were a commercial grower, of course, yeah, I would be a little more concerned about cross-pollination. Or if I was trying to develop a specific variety by cross-pollinating, yes, you take different steps to make sure you isolate those flowers to be able to set the fruit and the seed, but it's nothing I worry about, and nothing that I've ever seen the result of. Now, that's different. And so when we talk about the perfect flowers like that are pollinating themselves, that's different than the squashes and the melons and the types of plants that require pollination. If you're growing different squashes side by side, then you should expect cross-pollination just because of the insects that are flying back and forth. And so if you want to save the seeds from a squash or a melon, then you need to just be aware that cross-pollination needs to be dealt with before you save those seeds. And then you can, I've talked about a little bit about that. I'll be talking about that later in the year as we actually get to flowering season, how you can avoid some of those cross-pollination issues. Wanted to do a video last year, but never got around to it. So maybe I'll do a video on that this year. I've mentioned it in some of my videos, but I don't have a specific video on how to avoid cross-pollination. So one of those things I'll have to think about. But saying, since we are all planning our seed starting, it seems a good time to get your thoughts on planting by the phases of the moon. So good question. So a lot of gardeners do that. A lot of gardeners will plant by the phase of the moon. And so the full moon or the new moon, depending on what you're planting, and there's lots of different suggestions as to when is the best time to plant or when to sow seeds. I do not do it, but a big reason for that is because of my season. I'm growing in Colorado with a short growing season, and the first time I started looking into the phases of the moon to decide when I was going to sow, it didn't match with my soil temperature or my weather patterns. And so by planting with the phase of the moon, I was either going to put the seeds in the ground while it was still too cold, or I was going to put the seeds in the ground a week or two after an ideal starting time. So for me, the temperature is more of a driving factor. If I waited on the moon, I could lose a week or two to put my seeds in the ground, or I could start a week or two too early in getting the seeds in the ground. For other regions that are more temperate, and more moderate than Colorado, then yeah, go for it. If you've got a growing season that is 160 days long, it's not a big deal to just vary by a week or two as you're planting by the moon. But for me, where in a good year, my growing season is 120 days, yeah, that 2 weeks can make a big difference. So those are my thoughts. I don't do it, but I would do it just to see what happens if I had a much longer growing season. But it isn't something I've ever done because I'm focused more on the soil temperature and what's happening with the plants. Sunset Gazing is asking, how did your Galileo Moon tomatoes do this past year? Any seeds for purchase? So they're not available for purchase yet. And actually, I did not get fruit from my Galileo Moon tomatoes this last year, but that was because I was traveling. So I was traveling in the month of May to the UK. And again, same idea I was just talking about. I got the plants in the ground about almost 3 weeks later than I wanted to normally. And so that delay of getting those tomatoes in the ground meant that they were just beginning to fruit when I had my first frost. And so I actually wasn't able to harvest any of the Galileo Moon tomatoes this year. But I'm going to try again this year and we'll see. And as soon as I can get a good stockpile of those seeds, I'll open them up to all of you. So a year at the earliest. We have to wait and see how they turn out this year. But I am planning, of course, to grow more of my tomatoes and trying to get them to the point that I'm selecting, again, the strongest seeds. And that's what I've been doing for a period of years now. It's just selecting the seeds that look like they've stabilized genetically and saving the seeds of the best plants. And I'm waiting until I feel comfortable with that before I move forward and really make a concerted effort to share them. Pat is saying, love to buy cheap seeds to make seed bombs. Fun spring surprises. Absolutely. Yeah, I've got my video on making seed bombs. I'm sure Jay is going to post it if she hasn't already done so. And you're exactly right. You make a little clump of compost and clay and you put some seeds in it and you throw them into empty fields or even in your own garden. And cheap seeds are a great way to make some seed bombs and throw them around and see what pops up. So wonderful idea. Laura S is saying, I actually have experienced a cross in my tomatoes. Okay, cool. I'm currently working on stabilizing a cross that popped up a few years ago. They're a salad-sized peach tomato. Cool. And that's exactly what I was saying. Look for those things. I haven't seen them yet. But if you see something like that develop, just like my Galileo Moon was a tomato that had a genetic mutation because I was growing thousands of tomatoes at the Galileo school. And so I saved those seeds and I've been growing them for a number of years since to try to make sure that the genetics are stabilized, that genetic mutation is consistent through the plant as it moves forward. And so wonderful for you to have recognized that you had that and now working to stabilize it. Awesome. So kudos. That's wonderful. I love those kind of things. Larry Gardner, thank you again for your support. You're always so wonderful. Buying fewer seeds this year equals more money for donations. Well, that's a wonderful sentiment. And yeah, I love the idea of buying fewer seeds. I'm trying to buy fewer seeds this year as well, but using the seeds that you save as well. And I like that idea. If you have budgeted a certain amount in your garden for things like seeds, and you're finding that you aren't buying seeds, yeah, make donations. I love that idea. It's a great way to kind of spread the good feeling and the support that you can with others. So fantastic. I appreciate that sentiment a lot. Yeah, there's the link from Jay, how to make seed bombs or seed balls, depending on how you're going to use them. And I appreciate that. Donna Prima says, I would like to get some decent sized lettuce starts into my green stock in late March, with the last frost date of April 30th. Should I start indoors now? So depending on the lettuce, but most lettuces grow very quickly. And so like I've got lettuce growing in my green stock indoors. I did the video on growing indoors with the green stock recently, and I've got lettuce growing in it. And they're about 2 weeks, well, almost 3 weeks old now. So they're about 3 weeks old, and they're at the point that they could easily be transplanted. And so if you're looking at the end of April as the last frost date, depending on the lettuce, they can still handle some cold temperatures. And so first figure out how early you might want to put them into your green stock. You don't have to wait till after your last frost date for a lot of the lettuce varieties, but you don't want the plants too big. And so probably the beginning of April would be a good time to start thinking about getting the starts going, start sowing those seeds, so that by the middle of April, the plants are big enough for you to put outside. So end of March, beginning of April might be more appropriate, just so you don't have a full-size plant that you're trying to put out. And with lettuce, it's better to transplant a smaller plant than it is to do a bigger plant. But give it a try. If you've got extra seeds and you want to see what happens, and it's February, look at the seed packet. The seed packet will probably tell you. So if the seed packet says that it's 30 days to harvest and you're starting in February, you're going to be using them in March. So you definitely don't want to be starting now. If it is a head lettuce, which actually don't do as well in a green stock, but those take longer, and that might be a 45 or 60 day lettuce. So check out the lettuce and see when the harvest time is, kind of cut that in half, and that might be a good time to think about doing the transplanting. So if it's a 30-day lettuce, grow it for about 15 days and then transplant it outside. And kind of a basic guideline that can get you in the ballpark. So Bud, good to see you, and thank you for that. Thanks for all your wonderful content, both live and posts. I'm loving the monthly diary idea this year. Well, thank you, Bud. Thank you for supporting the channel so much for all these years. So I do appreciate it, and thank you for that. And yeah, if you haven't seen it, I talked about it over a month ago, where I was throwing out the idea of doing the monthly garden review. Many of you gave me feedback, and so I did it, and I've gotten some really good response from it, and I'll be doing that every month this year, potentially every month for the foreseeable future, where I'm just walking around the garden and talking about my garden and showing you the garden. And I actually enjoyed making that video. So thank you for saying that, because I'm having fun doing it, and I will definitely continue doing it. It's one of those things that if you're not doing it, I suggest that you do. And the idea being, and YouTube is a great opportunity, even if you're just doing it for yourself, but do a garden review every month. I've been doing it without necessarily turning it into a video. But yeah, go ahead and get outside, film your garden, film whatever it is you're doing. If you post it on YouTube, no one may ever see it, but that's a great place for you to store the footage of what's happening in your garden. And so it's kind of a historical record that you can always look back on. So you can do that. You're on YouTube now, you've got a YouTube channel. Think about doing some of your own filming and uploading just for yourself, so that you can do the same kind of thing I did, which is sharing your thoughts to yourself of what's happening in your garden and what you're thinking about. And it's an easy way to journal. It's an easy way to document what's happening. And don't be embarrassed by it, because again, unless you are cranking out the videos and trying to get views, chances are no one's going to see it. And so do it for yourself. It really can be a great way to track what's happening in the garden. Dave is saying, I was looking over old videos and saw a number of comments from you from back in November on canning. Did you end up getting canning done for yourself? So yeah, I did mostly fermenting. and powdering and the freeze drying. I did a little bit of canning. I think actually when it comes to canning, the only thing I did was a batch of tomatoes. But I did the fermenting of some peppers. I did some drying of peppers and a few other things on those lines. But like I said earlier, I got a late start on my season because of my travels. And so I didn't have as much to can and to process that I normally do. So it was a much lighter season with my preservation this last year. I do have some big travel plans coming up, but not during that critical start period. And so I am planning to do the big garden, growing lots of tomatoes, doing lots of processing. But thank you for asking that, Dave. I didn't get as much of the actual canning done as I had anticipated that I would, but we'll have to wait and see. Carla says that garden tour vid was very enjoyable. Gave me ideas as to what I should be looking at in my situation. Well, cool. Yeah, that's exactly the idea of me doing these videos, is to help you get ideas based on what you see someone else doing in their garden. And so keep that in mind as you either make a video for yourself, or those of you that have video or have channels where you're making videos for others. Often you can learn a lot just from somebody else doing something. I learn a lot in all the videos I watch just by seeing how other people are doing it. And I may not do it the way they do it, but at least it makes me think about what I'm doing in comparison with what they're doing. And I've modified my gardening a lot over the years just by seeing what somebody is doing or hearing what they're saying about what they're doing. And it really can make a big difference. So Shawnee is saying, actually, what's next on my list, which February may be a great time to prune for shrubs and trees for some areas. And yeah, for most of us, if we were to pick a month of the year that is best for pruning trees and shrubs, for most of us, it's February. Now, granted, if you're in the middle of summer, you can still do pruning. February is actually still a good month for pruning, but it's a different kind of pruning. So the summer pruning is usually done to promote bushiness. For some trees, it promotes the future development of fruit spurs. But for the rest of us that are in winter and doing winter pruning, February is a great month because almost all of us, even in warmer regions, the plants are dormant or mostly dormant. And that's when you really want to do the pruning for structural reasons. We're cutting out the dead branches. We're cutting out the diseased branches. I talk about cutting out the disorderly branches, the ones that are growing in the wrong direction. I talk a little bit about that in that video that I just did. And so you can see the tree, the leaves are not in the way, and you can see those dead and damaged and diseased branches that you need to prune out. And then you step back and you look at what's happening, where they're growing, and that's what I call disorderly. That's where you start pruning to maintain the structure of your tree. Now, this is most likely done with fruit trees, and it makes a big difference when you are pruning back your trees in February while they're dormant. You're not going to have pests burrowing into those new cuts that you've made. You're not going to have diseases setting into those new cuts that you made, which could happen during the summer months. And so it's an ideal time. The tree isn't stressed, doesn't feel any pain, really doesn't create any damage. And then a month from now, when the tree starts waking up, it's already structurally where you want it to be, and it just starts growing with the branches that are left behind. So yes, absolutely wonderful time to be thinking about pruning your shrubs and trees. I was out yesterday looking at my espalier trees, and we'll be filming it, maybe making a video about it, but I always film it because this is the time of year that I'm shaping my trees, that I'm doing the espalier, like putting them into very specific shapes. This is the time to do it when the trees are dormant, and you just choose a nice warm day. You could do it on a cold, snowy day. Nobody wants to do that. But I do days like we're having this week. This week, the forecast is fantastic. That's one of those activities I'm going to be out doing, is pruning my trees and shaping them and preparing them for all the new growth that is coming. And so if you were unsure about when to prune your trees, the answer is probably February. And that will prepare them for the upcoming season. So yeah, thank you for highlighting that, because that is one of those things. And now in conjunction with that, when I'm going out and I am pruning my trees, I'm also using February, using this time of year to get my tools ready to go. So you may have put your tools away at the end of the last growing season, and you're just now getting them out to start thinking about pruning your trees. Use this opportunity to sharpen your pruners. If you're using loppers or secateurs or pruning shears, this is a good time to clean them, to oil them, to sharpen them, and maybe to sterilize them. I don't worry too much about sterilizing, and you'll see this a lot in particularly older areas with the older gardening methods, where you take a pruning cut and then you sterilize your pruners, and then you take a pruning cut and then you sterilize your pruners. The reason for that is the assumption that there is disease in the garden, and that if you don't sterilize between every single cut, that you might be spreading disease from one branch to another, or from one tree to another. But like me, I don't have any tree diseases. I don't have that concern. So I'll clean my shears, I'll sharpen my shears, and then I'll go out and I'll just prune for an hour or two, and no sterilizing in between, because I don't have that problem. If I did, then yeah, I might take that extra precaution to sterilize. But take that into consideration as well. Just because you see recommendations from established magazines and books that you're supposed to sterilize, consider the context. Consider whether you've got disease in your garden at all that you need to be dealing with. And if you don't, make it easy on yourself. I don't like to work any harder than I have to. And so I'll go out with my loppers and with my pruning shears, and I'll bounce back and forth. If it's a thick branch, I use the loppers. If it's a thin branch, I use the pruning shears. And I did a little bit of pruning yesterday, or well, cutting back because of the raspberries. And I did both, depending on the size of the raspberry cane. So think about which type of cutting you're going to be doing and what kind of tool you need, and get the tool ready to go before you go outside, and then you can make quick work of it. Most of the branches that I'll be cutting back this year are still relatively small, but my fruit trees are now all in the 4-year range. I've got a couple that are 5 years old, a couple that are 3 years old. As the tree gets bigger, the branches get bigger. And in the early years of the growth of the tree, I allow more lower branches to grow for the leaves, to give the roots all the energy they need to promote the next year's growth. Well, now my trees are big enough that some of those lower branches that I left on the tree just to help support the growth of the tree, they now are ready to come off. And so I'll add a tree saw into my mix this year for some of those lower branches as I cut them off and shape the tree and start focusing on the bigger tree. Because I grow bare root trees. And so when I get my bare root tree, it might only be 3 or 4 feet tall. And I'm letting almost all the branches grow in that first year. And then the second year, I'll take off some of the lowest branches, and by then the tree might be 5 or 6 feet tall. Well, now my trees are in the 7 or 8 foot tall. Some of the bigger trees I've got, like my peach tree and my plum tree in particular. And so when you start getting to where the tree is taller than 6 feet or 7 feet, you'll need to think about how you want that lower portion. And so I want my first sturdy, heavy, permanent branches to be at about the 4-foot height. And so those branches that are at the 2-foot or 3-foot level, now they're coming down because I've already trained my tree to have those branches at about the 4-foot point, and now the tree is about 8 feet tall. I'll continue doing that structural pruning. And once those lower branches are gone, they're gone. But I don't want to take them off too early while the plant is still young. So I do have some videos on pruning the young, excuse me, the younger trees. And I hadn't actually planned on making a video on the older trees, but maybe I'll show you some of that in a video to come as I'm taking off some of those bigger branches, because that can be scary, and it can be stressful for you looking at this wonderful tree with these bigger branches at the bottom and deciding that you've got to cut it off. It's always hard to cut the branches, but it often needs to be done. And that's really the key point, is deciding why you're doing it and what you need to do to actually maintain the shape or promote the shape of the plant that you're looking for. So keep that in mind as you're doing the pruning. Dave's saying, I just planted out high value mega hot peppers and now have to go to Des Moines for a funeral. I'm sorry to hear that. Just made arrangements for the care of my 1 tray of seeds. Happy it wasn't more. So yeah, sorry to hear that, Dave. And that is always a challenge. I would caution you, just from experience, if you're using a heat mat, which you probably are if you're growing the mega hot peppers, the soil can dry out very quickly. I lost an entire batch of pepper seeds one year because of the similar situation where I was gone for a day and I thought the seeds would be okay, and the heat mat just dried out the soil, so that by the time I recovered after having missing a day, all the seedlings were dried and dead. So if you've made arrangements for care of that tray, make sure that it's being checked every day that you're gone, so that you don't have that same issue where they might dry out. You definitely don't want to have to come back and see that you've lost all your peppers. So a possibility to lessen that likelihood is just to turn off the heat mat while you're gone. It shouldn't make that big a difference with the seeds or the seedlings if they've emerged yet. And it might give you a little comfort knowing that they're not going to dry out because they're too hot. And then you get back, you can turn the heat mat back on again. Boothby Gardens is asking, any tips on adding linseed oil to wooden tools? Oh yeah, absolutely. I've got linseed oil, and that's what I use on the handles of my tools as well. So there's a couple different options. I don't know if you've ever heated. So one old timers method is to heat the linseed oil. I tried that once, didn't really notice much difference. But that's an option, is you boil the linseed oil and apply it to your wood handle. There's a couple different ways that I've seen it done, where you have like a lot of oil and you put it in a container and you just dip the handles in and then just let it soak for a little bit. I just take a rag and soak the soil on the rag and then just run with the grain on my handles. And so anymore, it's terrible. A lot of my old tools that I've had for a long time have the wooden handles, but it seems like pretty much everything else I've got that's more recent has a fiberglass handle or a plastic handle or a rubber handle. So I don't have as many wooden handles anymore. But like for my axe, That's one of the things I do. I still have a wooden handle axe, and I'll use linseed oil. But the key difference is just whether you heat it or not. But just if you don't, so I think when you boil it, when you heat it, it raises the wood fiber. The heat will actually cause the wood fiber to expand, and then when it cools, it kind of traps the oil in. I think that's the idea behind it. I just do multiple coats with a cool or room temperature linseed oil, and it seems to work fine. But I'm not overusing or abusing my wood handles where it's reached the point that it really needs that deep penetration, which is why you want to focus on regular upkeep of your tools so you don't have to do a recovery drench like that maybe. So just those are a couple tips, and that's really all I know about the linseed oil. I have tried, so when I was doing my book, I think there's a section in my book where I talk about oiling the beds for longevity, and I show a couple photos of me doing that, and I use linseed oil on some of my raised wooden beds. Linseed oil is the oil to use. So there's a couple different options, but even then, especially outside, I'm not going to boil linseed oil. I just painted it onto the wood, and it gets soaked up right away. If the wood is dry, it's going to soak up that oil in absolutely no time whatsoever. And so that's kind of what you're looking for, is how dry it is and whether it needs to be done or not. Wow, look at the time. We just I've just lost track of time, but it's crazy that we've been talking this whole time. Karen is asking, can stackable planters be used for heavy feeding plants like tomatoes, peppers, and squash? Maybe if I limit it to 1 or 2 plants per level. So yeah, absolutely. You know, green stock, of course, is my stackable planter of choice, and that is definitely a concern. So when you have the green stock, and in each of the tiers, you've got 6 of the pockets, and depending on which size you're using, whether it's the leaf or the original, as to how deep those pockets are, you're exactly right. And that is a consideration you should have, that each of those levels are adequate for supporting, I think, usually 2 or 3 plants per level. And depending on the type of plant, it might only be 1 or 2, like you're asking. So you have to anticipate what the root requirement is for that plant, and then how much soil is in that level. And so when it comes to peppers, I've actually grown 6 peppers on a level without any issue whatsoever. If I grew 6 tomatoes, I noticed that the tomatoes were stunted. So 3 tomatoes were probably a better choice. And then squash, the same thing. 1 or 2 squash for like a green stock level is probably appropriate. The other consideration when you're growing in containers, especially like stacking containers, is the nutrition. And so not only is there enough soil for the roots to grow into, but is there enough nutrition in that soil to feed the plants? And you're, in almost all cases, going to need to use fertilizer periodically during the growth, because the nutrients are going to be sucked up from the plants pretty quickly on each of those levels. So be aware of that. It is a wise question for you to ask, to be thinking about not planting too much within a confined space. And it holds true in pots, it holds true in any kind of container. If you've got a finite amount of soil, it can only support a specific number of plants. And if you try to grow more plants, then all of the plants are going to end up being stunted because they don't have the space for the roots to grow, or they don't have enough nutrients for the plants to do well. Shandy's Garden says, Greenstock tip, since I like to hand water and turn my tower at the same time, I don't use the top watering reservoir. I plant out the top tier with herbs. It's a nice reservoir and lid if I wanted it. Great suggestion. And I end up doing the same thing. I like hand watering my garden in general because I can see how the plants are doing. I can see if there's any disease or pests developing. And yes, I end up doing that in my green stock as well, where in most of the time I am hand watering each of the plants. And absolutely, that top reservoir is intended to just pour the water in, and then the water drains all the way through the tower. You could use that top reservoir as a planting container, and you've just added more space to grow if you're going to do that hand watering. So yeah, good tip. You actually can do that and have success. And Laura says peppers did fantastic in the green stock. I did 3 peppers and 3 bean plants in each level. There you go. It really can work well. So time has flown by. Thank you so much for all your attention today. I hope that you will get out now into your garden and start thinking about some of the things we talked about today and be active. Even if right now it's cold for you, and there's a lot of areas of the country that are still under a cold snap, you can still get out and start thinking about what needs to be done in the garden, the cleaning, the pruning, the adding the extra mulch, the planning. All of these things and more can be done in February. So this is also a good month to start getting excited with the warming days and the increased sunlight to get out in the garden and start figuring out what you're going to do. So get out there, get excited, and of course, have fun with it. I'll see you next week as we all get outside and enjoy gardening.